Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Karan Mahajan, and I'm the author of The Association of Small Bombs. And it's a real pleasure to be back in Texas because I actually wrote this novel while I was living about an hour and a half from here in Austin. And people would often ask me while I was living there, how is it that you're writing a book about New Delhi while living in Austin? And I would point to the sweat pouring down my face and my brows and on my legs, and it always felt to me that the heat in Texas was as majestic and crazy as the heat in India. And it was only towards the end of writing The Association of Small Bombs that I realized that Delhi and Austin are nearly at the same latitude, which was a nice piece of luck. And I think you always need some luck when you're completing a long project like a novel. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the idea behind the book and how I arrived at it. The novel is essentially about the unfurling consequences of a so-called small bombing that happens in a marketplace in New Delhi in 1996, and its effects on the perpetrators and the victims. And the roots of the book lie in the time about 17 years ago when I first came to the US from India for college. Um, it was 2001, and I was going to be traveling alone for the first time. And a week before I was to leave Delhi, planes crashed into the World Trade Center. And like everyone all over the world, my parents and I watched the news unfold in complete horror. We had been to that part of New York, we knew that area well, and we were devastated by what happened. But also, like most other people, we were caught up in our own petty concerns. My parents were adamant that I not go to college anymore, that I take a year off. They were afraid I'd get drafted, which seems kind of prescient in retrospect. Um, my response was much simpler. I said, Mom and Dad, I need to attend freshman orientation. Um, I need to read the Zadie Smith and Vikram Seth book that's been assigned to me as part of my first year reading experience. Um, Amazingly, I won that argument, and a week later, I was on a plane from Delhi to San Francisco, and the plane was almost entirely empty. And I would change seats every few hours just because I could. Um, and also because we didn't know what the security situation would be, I didn't carry any hand baggage over this 30-hour flight. Instead, my dad had made me wear this enormous green fishing jacket that he owns. And it had many different zips and compartments. There was one for traveler's checks, one for the passport, another held about 2 books. And it's only in retrospect when I look at pictures of myself from that time that I realize that it looked like a suicide vest. Um, anyway, I landed in San Francisco and I settled into life on the West Coast. And though I didn't face any open discrimination, it was a very tense time to be a newcomer to this country. And my Muslim friends in particular were being subjected to all sorts of new restrictions and controls by the government. They had to go to San Jose to register with the government. And if each time they left the country or they came back, they had to undergo very lengthy and humiliating interviews. And there was also a very general conflation of Islam and Islamic fundamentalism going on, which of course continues to this day. And you did feel that as a brown person, you were being enfolded within this larger narrative that you couldn't control. And I think it was partly out of that feeling that I first began to write fiction. I wanted to respond to these stereotypes that were flourishing. And I wanted to give an accurate sense of what life is in other countries. So fast forward a few years, and it's now 2008, and I'm living in New York, and I've published a novel, and it sounds like a dream, but I was dirt poor, and I was working full-time for the New York City government. And it was while I was there that I heard that terrorists had stormed the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay. You might remember this event. It was India's 9/11, essentially. 10 terrorists took over South Bombay and for 4 days went around shooting down Indians and foreigners. And in the end, about 160 people were killed. Many more were injured. Countless were traumatized. Most of the terrorists were killed. One was captured. And again, I had the strange experience of being across a sea watching the event on TV. But this particular time, I found myself particularly and personally enraged by what was happening. And I remember walking around New York in a kind of daze of anger, wishing not only the terrorists ill, but also the entire world they represented. And it was at that point that I paused and I thought, what's the source of this? I wasn't there. Why have I internalized this to such a large degree? And isn't this also exactly what the terrorists want? So it was from that moment of despair and self-reflection that the image of this smaller bombing that had happened in a marketplace in New Delhi, near where I grew up when I was about 12 years old, that this image came back to me. The year had been 96, and Kashmiri separatists had set off this bomb using a car, and 13 people were killed and 30 were injured. And it was a market, a very ramshackle bazaar that I knew very well because I'd gone there often. And my own grandmother had been there the day before to buy yarn. And so it had stuck in my mind as an incident in which I could have lost a family member. And I began to think now, what were the victims and the perpetrators of that attack feeling and thinking now that we had entered into an era of terrorism, an era of internationalized syndicates of terror? And that became the seed for the book. Now, I wanted to write about both the victims and the terrorists right from the start, but I didn't want their lives to unfold in parallel tracks. I wanted them to overlap. But I also knew that practically speaking, in the real world, victims and terrorists might never actually see each other or talk to each other. So I began to focus on the emotional overlaps that exist between the two categories of people. So with one, there's always the scorched patch of earth that is electrified with meaning for both the terrorists and the victims. Then, when I went around to the market to do research, to talk to the shopkeepers, this was about 14 years after the bombing, I discovered that they were not mad at this point at the terrorists, but they were angry at the government because they felt that the government had neglected them, not paid out the compensation they'd been promised, and that they were being forgotten by history. And in a way then, the terrorists' goals had been accomplished. They'd succeeded in alienating a pocket of the Indian population. Finally, the two groups of people share a sense of victimhood. Terrorists are people who have a great sense of grievance, and they believe they aren't being heard. And so they think that the only way to get attention is to kill people. Terrorism really is a scream of male entitlement. And it's also a desperate bid to try to change the course of history. So as I began to think about the idea, I drew on multiple sources outside this smaller bombing. For example, in 2004, Osama bin Laden gave a speech in which he boasted that he had single-handedly brought down the US economy. And his reasoning went, well, 9/11 cost Al-Qaeda about $500,000, but the US had this outsized reaction and started a war in Afghanistan and a war in Iraq, which ballooned the deficit, which in turn has led to Congress to stall and caused all these other problems with interest rates. And it struck me then that the reaction to a terrorist event is almost as important as the event itself. In the ideal world, I think one wouldn't respond to a provocation, but of course that's not how humans work. Humans are filled with fear. They might carry an injury with them for years. They might be extremely enraged by what happens. And so as I began to write about the victims of this bombing, I named the sections after their responses to terror. And I wanted to show the ways in which people have succumbed to fear in this era of terrorism, and also how we as bystanders have allowed terrorists to make this an era of terrorism. There were two sets of victims that I wrote about. One is a middle-class couple named the Khuranas, who lose both their children in the attack and are obviously extremely devastated and spend the rest of their lives thinking about this bombing. And then I had a 12-year-old boy named Mansoor, a young Muslim boy, who is injured in the attack but escapes and does his very best to not think about what's happened to him, to not think about terrorism, but is repeatedly pulled back into the orbit of radical religion despite his best attempts. And to write this character, I certainly drew on my own experiences because I had Mansoor be someone who goes to the US and is still injured and comes back. And when he comes back, he has a kind of religious awakening. But it was very important for me to try to write that kind of experience from the inside out, rather than letting words like radicalism and jihad obscure my understanding of what it was going on. Because in a way, those words from overuse have lost their meaning. The hardest part of the book, though, was writing the terrorists and understanding their motivations. Because, of course, we can all understand why someone would have a grievance, but it's harder to understand why someone who is a fairly rational, intelligent person would go through with mass murder. You know, for example, the 9/11 hijackers spent a year living in the US before they went through with their attacks. And there must have been many times when they could have gone back on their plan. When people theorize as to why they went ahead, I think the easiest explanation is to say, oh, they had faith and they had religion. But I think it's much more likely that they were grappling with self-doubt and confusion and fear. And in fact, if you look at the history of terrorism, that is borne out by the fact that most attacks are botched, that they aren't carried out perfectly, or that they're suspended at the last minute. You can think about the attack that just happened in the Times Square subway station, where the man essentially succeeded in blowing himself up, but not really injuring anyone else. So I thought that a failed attack would be much more representative of the era of terrorism than one of the really successful ones like 9/11 or 26/11, which is the Bombay attack. And it was from this idea that I got the character of Shaki, who is a Kashmiri bomb maker. And essentially, I wrote Shaki as if he were a kind of craftsman, someone who was interested mainly in the practicalities of bomb making, questions of how he would get the ingredients for the bomb, how he would transport it, how he would plot the bombing. But because he was so consumed by these details, wouldn't really think about what he was doing to people. And I think this is something we all do in different ways. I know certainly when I'm writing a novel, I'm so obsessed with semicolons and periods and words that often I forget that what I'm writing will have real-world consequences. And this has been the section of the book that has generated the most conversation when I speak to college students, because it's the first time in some ways in fiction that the dailiness, the mundaneness of terrorism has been explored, and the people behind these attacks have been shown to be not these superhuman devils that we imagine them to be in the news, but rather to be criminal operatives who might be even inept or bumbling at times. And people often ask me how I was able to get into the minds of these characters. And my response is that there's a difference between empathy and seeing something clearly. And my attempt with Shaki was to present him three-dimensionally in space and to show the ways in which he goes about his business. And I do believe that seeing clearly is a way of extinguishing our own rage about things. College students today, I think, are exposed to a lot of bad behavior online. And the first instinct I think we all have is to condemn it. but it's only by seeing it clearly that we can get to the roots of what's going on. The book also explores this question of how one might write about the so-called other. And my answer to that is that it requires an immense amount of delicate research, but also the other is a made-up concept, and it's very important when you're a writer to put yourself emotionally into whoever you're writing and to recognize that people aren't, in the end, that different. So this is all very serious, but there were also fairly comical things that happened while I was writing the book, which took about 5 years. You know, it was not great to be a brown guy Googling the word bomb like every day for 5 years. Though I guess in the end I have the word in the title of my novel, so that battle's been won or lost, depending on how you see it. You know, I had dozens of books about terrorism checked out from the library. I was traveling all over India, talking to people about the subject. And of course, the thing that happens to brown men happened to me, which is that when I was in Austin at the airport one morning, I was pulled out of this line for a random check, told I tested positive for explosive traces. And as I was led away by these very incompetent TSA agents who were kind of debating how they should be patting me down, the only thought I had is, I really hope they don't open my backpack, because in my backpack is a manuscript of the Association of Small Bombs. And the last thing I want to do is deliver a craft lecture to the TSA, explaining the difference between fiction and nonfiction. But luckily, you know, it was a novel, so no one looked at it or read it. And, and I was led away, and I was fine. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, you know, I feel very lucky. This is a very difficult, painful subject to write about, but I've been touched by the response the book has generated in both India and the US, where it's been treated as a novel of ideas rather than a primer on how Indians live. And it was always my intention that it would speak to universal themes and ideas, that it would speak to the many seemingly small and meaningless bomb blasts happening in many countries around the world, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. And I think that luckily for me, right from the beautiful cover of the book, it has been received not as an ethnic novel, but a novel about terrorism. So thank you so much for your time.